very moment, in fact. Okay, it is a free country. We've got a lot of freedom. That means people have the opportunity to discover its work. You know, it's not going to come easily. It's where the internet is helpful. They have the opportunity to discover the relevant facts and background, which should show them that their position is contradictory. They must come to understand what the U.S. government role has been over the years in preventing the outcome that they want.
Okay. Do you in the end then, if in fact, accept the premise that people get, for the most part in a democracy, people get the government they deserve?
No, I don't.
You don't?
No, in fact,
and you, because
not
you
at all.
Well, let me finish. Because you believe the political process is corrupt.
It's not corrupt.
It's what?
Look.
See, whenever anybody says "look" to me, I know they're saying
it's not that simple.
Right.
I mean, it's not that there's robbery and stealing of elections. There is a distribution of power internal to the country, enormous disparity of economic and other power, and that influences everything that happens in dramatic ways. So many issues simply don't come up in elections.
So the haves have more power than the have-nots, and therefore
overwhelmingly.
they're able to exercise it.
In fact, if you really look closely, elections, they restrict themselves to issues on which the population, they eliminate issues where the mass of the population opposes a lead opinion, systematically. And the population is aware of this.
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Well, let's take a concrete case,
right.
Okay? The year 2000 election, say. Among the issues that were highest in concern to the general population are things that roughly relate to the so-called trade agreements. So deficits, overseas investment, the transfer of jobs, you know, lots of topics like that. Right at that time, there was a plan for an international hemispheric conference at Quebec, hemispheric summit a few months later, which was intended to extend the NAFTA-type agreement to the whole hemisphere. Now, these are issues of enormous concern to people. Did it come up in the election? No. And there's a reason why it didn't come up in the election, and it's consistent. On those issues, the public tends to oppose policies on which there is an elite consensus, and therefore it doesn't come up in elections. Well, that's part of the reflection.
But I mean, let me just make sure I understand. How do you stand yourself on the NAFTA agreement?
I agree with the general population. I think if
you agree with the general population, whose view is
critical.
Critical of it because
it's the wrong agreement. If you go back to 1990, 10 years ago, when the NAFTA agreement was coming along, there were serious critical analyses of it, which were in favor of a North American free trade agreement, but not this one. The analyses came from the labor movement. They came from Congress's Research Bureau, the Office of Technology Assessment. Pretty much the same analyses said, yeah, a North American economic agreement would be a good idea, but this one is designed as effectively an investor rights agreement. It privileges rights of investors and lenders, and it marginalizes the rights of people.
And were you worried about the loss of jobs and those kinds of issues that became a political football? The unions essentially were opposed to it.
That's the story, but it's not true.
Not true. In other words, you're saying that then they misled us when they made that argument?
No, the unions did not make
They never made an argument that we were opposed because of jobs?
They mentioned that, but the labor movement had an official position. It was produced by the Labor Advisory Council, a long, detailed analysis, and it was a very sensible position. It was never given, it never entered the media discussion. It was never given any publicity. The labor movement was accused of crude nationalism, this, that, and the other thing. That was not their position. Their actual position never made it to the public agenda. And the same is true of Congress's own Research Bureau, which had a rather similar analysis. Yes, in favor of a NAFTA-style agreement, but not that one. It's kind of interesting that a few days ago, the Carnegie Endowment released an analysis of NAFTA, saying a fairly critical analysis. It was reported in the press, making some proposals as to how it should have been done. And those proposals, though they didn't say so, happen to be very similar to those that were proposed by the labor movement and Congress's Research Bureau 10 years ago, but didn't enter the political discussion, was not mentioned in the media, for example. Well, this is only one example of which there are numerous. ones in which
basically saying that what you're arguing is that people are not getting the information they need to make wise choices.
they aren't, nor in fact are they given the choice. They aren't given the choice.
The choice between who are the two parties nominated in an election.
No, that they have, but the two parties represent essentially the same concentration of interests. Look,
concentration of economic power.
Look, the United States is essentially a one-party state. It has two factions of the business party. In fact, one of the leading political science analyses of the nature of the U.S. party system by a fine political scientist at the University of Massachusetts, Tom Ferguson, is what he calls the investment theory of politics. Investors get together to invest to control the state.
Well, let me ask you this. Let's take 2 or 3 countries where you and I know, okay? Yeah. We have 2 parties in the United Kingdom, right? Mm-hmm. We have the Tory party and the Labour party. Would you say the same thing about them? Essentially?
It depends when. By today it's close to true.
Okay. In France, you have a socialist party and the Chirac-Gaullist party. Essentially the same. I mean, there's not a whole lot of differences there. I mean, they have 35-hour week. In Spain, we have socialist party.
Well, I would suggest we take.
Is it any different in any of those countries in terms of how much difference there is between the two parties? Because let me make this argument with you and just get the. Essentially, in most countries, the battle in politics is for the center, is it not? In most places. Now, that doesn't mean that.
That's simply not true. I mean, there are countries that have a much more lively democratic culture. So let's take a country that has a really lively democratic culture, much more than we do.
Like?
Brazil.
Okay.
Brazil is a rich, potentially rich, important country. In Brazil, something just happened recently, which should humiliate us. They give us a real lesson in democracy. In Brazil, popular movements, large-scale popular movements, which had been developing over 20 years, reached a scale where they were able to elect a populist president over the opposition of highly concentrated capital and media concentration. We can't even dream of that.
Well,
that's a functioning democratic culture.
Let me stop you for a second. Let me just get a couple of questions in. Number one, I asked that question recently of Gary Wills was here. Mm-hmm. Why haven't we seen in the United States more success by a powerful coalition, essentially coming from the left, but not necessarily defined by what the conception, traditional conventional wisdom might be of the left, of labor, minorities, poor, black and white.
We have seen it.
What was it the last time you saw it?
A number of times. We saw it in the 60s. That's where the Great Society programs come from. We saw it in the 30s. That's where the New Deal comes from. And in fact, this is a battle that goes back to the origins of American history. The original constitutional framework, the way Madison...
The author of the Great Society programs was Lyndon Johnson.
That's right. And the programs are not initiated by leaders. That's a serious misunderstanding.
Well, those programs were initiated primarily by people who actually, many of them who'd served with FDR.
See, that's a serious misinterpretation, I believe, of the way the political system works. Leaders may sign their names and they may push programs, but they do it because a popular constituency is compelling them to do it. That's the way changes take place. I mean, if there's a large-scale popular movement and there are pressures, there'll be somebody who'll say, I'm your leader, I'll sign it.
But since you've made the Great Society...
And what happened in the programs that came out of the so-called Great Society were the result of popular ferment and activism and changes that were taking place, significant changes that were taking place in the 1960s, which very much democratized the society. And it led to these programs. Since then, there's been an enormous counterattack from business sectors trying to beat it back. And that's the course of history. It's the same with the civil rights movement. It was the same with the labor movement.
But let me make this point about Lyndon Johnson, because a lot of other things, and I want to say that we're 42 minutes in, we're doing an hour with you, and I want to invite you back because in